Welcome to another episode of Tyrannus Hall, a grace-filled space to talk about the missional mandate of the Canadian Reformed Churches. My name is Winston Bosch. I'm here with my co-host, Bill DeYoung, and together today we have the pleasure of interviewing Pastor Steve Bray. We're going to the far east today, to the far east of Canada, to one of the least churched parts of Canada. We're going all the way to Newfoundland, and we're going to talk to Steve Bray, who's the lead pastor at Calvary Baptist Church in St. Johns, Newfoundland. So, Steve, welcome to the podcast. So glad that you could be here with us today.
Thank you both for having me. It's a joy and a privilege to be able to do this and to talk to other Christians across our great country.
Yeah, so why don't we start off with this? Tell us a little bit about yourself, Steve. Tell us a little bit about you, your family, how the Lord took hold of your life and saved you. Tell us a little bit about who we're speaking with today.
Yeah, so I'm a native Newfoundlander. I was born and raised here, born in St. John's, raised in a community called Harbour Grace, which is about 90 kilometers outside of St. John's. I'm an only child. My parents come from a United Church, an Anglican church background, but God gloriously saved them about 2 weeks apart when I was approximately 5 years old. And so from that point onward, I was just, obviously exposed to an evangelical gospel my entire life. My parents, when they got saved, got all the way saved, so to speak, and they wanted to save the world. So I was exposed to a lot of things. I think we had 12 foster brothers and sisters in my lifetime. Our house, the basement, was converted into a school for those that had physical or mental disabilities, a lot of those types of things. And then my father left his job in the phone company and became a Baptist pastor, planted a church in Harbour Grace with another couple. And so the whole idea of, just being around community and Christianity and church planting and evangelicalism has just been a part of my life. Now, when I was 14, when you have all of that wonderful, challenging kind of aspects of culture and life come into your home, there's a lot of good, bad, and ugly with that as well. And I was exposed to a lot of those things. That's a whole other topic for another day. But I did get somewhat resentful and bitter towards my parents, the church, and actually ran away from, and that's a whole other story. But God in his mercy brought me back just within a year. My father told my mom and dad everything that had happened. My father temporarily left the ministry, dedicated himself to being my dad. My dad is my earthly hero. And because of that, God used that to bring me to him. I'm married to my childhood sweetheart. I've known her since she was 5 years old. We started dating when we were 16 and got engaged when I was 19, married when I was 20. We have 3 adult children and we almost have 3 grandchildren. And then I went into ministry. I was in the business retail world, went into ministry in my mid-20s and been a pastor for just a little over 25 years. I have pastored churches in Nova Scotia and in Prince Edward Island, and now back here in Newfoundland. And I had the love affair of my life in regards to ministry in Prince Edward Island for 15 years at a Baptist church there. Just really raised our family there. Actually, we're a very Atlantic Canadian family. Our firstborn son was born in Nova Scotia. Our secondborn son was born in Newfoundland, and our daughter was born in PEI. So I told my wife we were never moving to New Brunswick because that would have been a need for another child. But anyway, we really loved it. And through that ministry, started a TGC Atlantic Canada chapter, which Winston, you and I share a little bit in common with TGC Canada. And that took notice. I took an interest in Newfoundland, and there's a whole story behind that. But God in 2015 in his sovereignty brought me back here to St. John's, took on the lead elder role at this church called Calvary Baptist. And then about 3 years ago, we launched a church planting initiative, which I'm sure we'll talk about. But that is definitely the Coles Notes of quite a sovereign journey that God took me on to save my soul.
Yeah, so we know each other a little bit, Steve, through right. TGC, the gospel. Did you, in your household, did you grow up with parents who were teaching you the Reformed persuasion of salvation? Did you get a hold of that a little bit later? You're a Baptist, we're not, but we share a Reformed understanding of salvation. How did that come about in your life?
Yeah, so I was raised actually in a very, very conservative, classic fundamentalist Baptist tradition, very King James only, lots of standards, those types of things, but also very kindly Arminian. And so, very decision-based, sinner's prayer-based. So Yeah, so I was in Bible college, and my friend, a very close friend, we were driving back. So he had started to unpack this idea of the sovereignty of God and what he called, a very foreign expression to me, the doctrines of grace, in which he told me that God was sovereign, and he basically gave me, the acronym of TULIP, told me about this guy named RC Sproul. And to be completely honest, I got so angry with him, I pulled my car over, kicked him out of my car, told him to walk back to the campus. But in fairness to him, because probably I felt bad for doing that, I watched these 2 VHS series by Sproul, Chosen by God, and that started me down a journey of sovereignty and doctrines of grace. And I never looked back. It has caused me a number of relational strains, but it is something I would never, ever take back. And so from that, I went to a much more reformed leaning seminary to do my MDiv. And I've basically just been walking down that road of Reformed theology ever since. And, so thankful for that. I guess maybe the one thing I've tried to do, especially in my Baptist tradition, Greg Foster has that book, The Joy of Calvinism. I've tried to skip the acronyms of, the caged Calvinist or that cold calculating type of stuff, and just try to model and live out a really joyous understanding of God's unmitigated sovereignty and how that can calm your heart. That can give you a great theology of suffering. It also gives you a great understanding of how to worship God with great joy and a great humility. And also, actually, quite frankly, I believe a good view of the sovereignty of God drives mission, aka even church planting here in Canada.
Well, let's grab a hold of that, because that's a good segue. We want to talk about Mile One Mission, which is a church planting network that you've started out of your church. But tell us a little bit about what you mean by that. Like, how does your understanding of Reformed theology propel you into mission? Yeah, so a long story, how even the Lord brought me back to Newfoundland. As I said, I'm a native Newfoundlander. I was very burdened for our city here. We are the oldest city, or we would claim to be the oldest city in North America, founded in 1497. There was a bit of a strong Christian heritage by Anglicans. A guy named Lawrence Coughlin was sent here by Whitfield and Carey. And there was that one little spark of this. But unfortunately, that largely gave way to cultural religion. And so we were a very, very culturally religious province here. But I would keep my eye on Newfoundland from Prince Edward Island. I had a beautiful church. It was a healthy size. We had a growing Christian school. I was loved by my congregation. My family was happy. And there's a very, very small evangelical witness here in St. John's. There's only actually 3 Baptist churches in all of St. John's. They have nothing to do with each other. So I would try to keep my eye on things. Calvary Baptist was much more reformed leaning. They had a pastor actually sent out from Bethlehem Baptist from John Piper's church. So I made sure I reached out to him, but he then resigned and left. And then they got another pastor from Florida who was also reformed in his theology. So again, I introduced myself to him, wanted to be an encouragement to him. Newfoundland's an island. It's isolating. If you're from the States and you come here, it's culture shock times 10. Tragically, he only stayed about 18 months, and he called me to tell me he was leaving. So I took out my notepad and I said, okay, brother, how can I pray for Calvary? What kind of pastor should I be looking for? And then he said, I think you should come. And I laughed and said, yeah, no, that's great. I'm pretty happy with my life here in Charlottetown. And he said, no, I really do. And again, I laughed him off. I went home, laughed it off to my wife. My best friend, who was a church planter in South Africa, who is married to one of our close friends from here in Newfoundland, I called him to tell him about it and laughed it off. And he said, well, are you going to pray about it? I said, no, I'm not going to pray about it. I love it here in PEI. And then he said, in a very, was it John Flavel with Calvin's friend, in a very, nice way, said, well, then you're a hypocrite. And I was like, well, that's very nice of you to say. He said, look, I'm not telling you God's calling you to Newfoundland, but if you won't even pray about it or talk to the Lord about it, nobody talks about Newfoundland more than you do. And so I give you that segue to let you know that through that, the Lord actually was calling us back here. And so my wife and I really felt that God wanted us to come here. The church brought me in as the lead elder. I promised the church I would spend at least a year just studying my city again. I hadn't lived here in over 15 years. Really getting a lay of the land. I would just focus on Calvary, but that I wanted to know what God had called me back here for.
By doing that, I discovered just how barren and how much the gospel, a true robust gospel, a great understanding of
Steve, I want to interrupt you here with a question and then give you the opportunity to continue your story, which is fascinating.
Absolutely. No.
And my question has to do with, is this true of all the Atlantic provinces? It's not the association I have in my mind with places like Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. Are there healthy evangelical churches in those provinces? And then if so, what accounts for the wilderness that exists in Newfoundland, which I think is where you were going anyhow?
Yeah, that's a great question, Bill. So from a Baptist perspective, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Prince Edward Island, it's almost a little bit like a Bible Belt. I mean, there's the convention Baptist churches there that they would claim, I think, to have over 400 churches in those three provinces. There's definitely much more of a robust variety of evangelical churches. That is not to say there's not room for church planting in those provinces, especially Halifax. I would say Halifax is becoming, because it's one of the fastest growing cities in all of Canada, very diversified. So I would say Halifax would be one that's very close to St. John's. But no, there'd be much more. The reason I think we're having this is because, so in Newfoundland, there's really only 5 religions, okay, or denominations. You're either Catholic, Anglican, United Church of Canada, Salvation Army, or Pentecostal. Those are the basic 5 religions that made it to the shores of Newfoundland and in any way took root. Until, I believe, the 1970s, Baptists were registered as a cult with our provincial government. If you say anything beyond those 5 religions, if I said, do you know the Canadian Christian Federation or Reformed? If I said Dutch Christian Reformed, if you say Presbyterian, if you said Christian Missionary Alliance, or you said AGC, or nobody in Newfoundland knows what you're talking about. When you say Mennonite Brethren, they don't think church, they think Amish, like in Pennsylvania, that, that type of thing. It's just not here. So you're Catholic, you're Anglican, you're United Salvation Army, or Pentecostal. Tragically, all of those have drifted, some so far. And a lot of people don't realize that one of the largest sex scandals of the Catholic Church happened here in St. John's. The Mount Carshel Children's Orphanage was just a massive mess of abuse and embarrassment. However, it created a cultural religion. We only lost our religious school system just before 2000. So, in my family, you give my mother a last name, she knows if you're Catholic or Anglican. We're also very Irish here. We're very Irish influenced and all those types of things. So that's one of the big reasons. Again, the other deceptive thing, Bill, about Newfoundland is we are known in our country for our 2 things, our humor and our hospitality. And so that is true. But when people have come here to try and bring true evangelical gospel here, they've misread the culture in the sense that our humor and our hospitality is confused for acceptance and trust. Newfoundlanders are very cynical, very mistrusting. Our view here is that many people have come here to take and not give. There's a lot of stereotypes, a lot of those types of things. And so we're quick to invite you into the kitchen. We'll feed you. We'll have a good time, have a kitchen party. You're not getting to the living room very quickly here. Much of the church planting or evangelical attempts in the last 50 years here have been to parachute somebody in here, largely not at all associated with here, with little to no support. And basically, it's just a tragic tale of failed attempts, which just drives up the cynicism and the suspicion of your average Newfoundlander versus the Maritimes. Even those terminologies people don't realize. When you say the Maritimes, you refer to Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and PEI. That's not Newfoundland. Atlantic Canada includes Newfoundland. So we get people coming down here from Toronto saying, oh, I'm here in the Maritimes. And a Newfoundlander will very quickly correct you. So that's some of those tensions. But so that's a little bit of the backstory. And studying this, believe it or not, in our St. John's. And so our province only has 527,000 people. Over 300,000 of those 527 are on what's called the Avalon Peninsula, which is just this very thing that's where St. John's is. And 250,000 of that is all within what we would call the St. John's regional municipality. So if you take that 250,000 people, you'd only have 20 2 potential evangelical churches. And I'm being very generous in my definition of that, because that includes Pentecostal, Salvation Army, Baptist. There's one Open Brethren church here. Then there's a few fringy little church startups that are basically different shades of Pentecostalism. And so that's all of that put together. And their combined attendance, you wouldn't get to 2,000 to 2,200 people total. And so when I did the math on that, when I was here in 2015 and through to 2016, I realized just how barren this place was. So I went to my elders, kind of unpacked all this information. And this was the question I started with. What would be better for St. Johns, Newfoundland? A church of 2,000 or 10 churches of 200 strategically located in neighborhoods around our city that actually reflected our neighborhoods and yet also coalesced and worked well as a network? Because you got to understand our culture. We are a very neighborhood-driven culture. We're very family-oriented. Everything we do is that way. So it took a while because our church was very much influenced by the Southern Baptist Convention, seeing like the big churches, the mega churches, these types of things. And I think that there was some interest in our congregation to have just a bigger, better, flashier church. But as we prayed through it and the men really started to size up our city, we came to the decision that what was best for us to reflect the kingdom and really impact our city was to target neighborhoods. And so that's what we started to do. And so our goal, by God's grace, is to try and raise up a combination of people that come help us and raise up Indigenous Newfoundlanders to plant 10 churches in strategic neighborhoods all around our city that reflect those neighborhoods. Everybody lives in those neighborhoods. They spend time there. They're known there. And yet, as each church, Lord willing, gets planted and established, there is a coalescing network sense of family amongst us as a group of churches. And we believe that that will do more to spread the gospel, show the glory of God. And back to Winston, your original question, I really believe that, what God said to Paul in Corinth, don't leave here, don't be afraid. I have much people in this city. I believe in the sovereignty of God. I believe that God, my prayer is always, Lord, as a reward for the suffering of your son, just show us who you have chosen in this city. And we just want to reflect that. And I guess a little bit because I still love my country, Canada, and I feel sometimes we suffer from small dog syndrome as the Church of Canada because we are next to the United States. I'm also hoping that perhaps this model can show the rest of our country that we can kind of come together and coalesce around something like this. It might be a way for us to see how we can connect across the country.
I want to interject with another question related to this. I think the model that you're proposing for the region of St. John would probably work well, in fact, in any Canadian city. I really like that idea of multiplying churches throughout an urban center so that you have strong gospel churches in every city neighborhood.
Right.
Now, suppose that the Lord is very gracious and kind and you're able to launch 10 churches. What would be the relationship among these churches? Is there the idea that you would continue to pool resources among the 10 churches, or would they become, purely autonomous on their own and independent of one another? How do you envision that occurring?
Yeah, that's a great question, Bill. So again, I'm not a great initiator, creator. I'm a great monkey see, monkey do. So again, because of my Celtic connection, believe it or not, when I was here and I was looking, west across the country and even to the United States, my culture is so unique. I found it very hard to find models that I could look at. So I actually jumped the ocean and went over to Europe, over to the UK. I had developed a relationship with a guy named Mez McConnell, who started a group called 20 Schemes, and it wrote this book called Church in Hard Places. And so I read that, gobbled it up. So much of it resonated with me and my culture. So I went over to Scotland and actually met with them, developed a wonderful friendship. These guys have been here to Newfoundland. So I just saw how they did things, and that's what we started to replicate. So what we've done here Calvary acts as kind of this hub church initially. We're raising the money. I actively try to seek out church partners, people to help us. That's a bit of a squirrel discussion. But so the idea is we plant a church. The church comes under the authority of the eldership of Calvary Baptist, but we then create a core team, our church planter, and all of them live in the neighborhood where we're planting the church. Everybody is from the neighborhood, and we are unapologetic and we're relentless in that. So nobody even from Calvary who, lives in another neighborhood but gets all excited and says, well, I want to go to that church. No, if you do, move there, move into the neighborhood. That's the whole MO. But what we're going to do is, until a church has a plurality of elders, while it is one elder or less, it always then comes underneath the eldership of Calvary. So that's one of the ways that we're going to kind of try to always keep that connection. Once they do have an established plurality of elders, they are their own local church, but we are building into the DNA because we're recruiting everybody, we're training them, we're kind of teaching this model. So the idea is that we will lovingly work together. And as each church grows and matures and becomes financially self-sufficient, they will do that. But it will be organic for us to want to help each other because we'll truly be a family of churches. And each church will reflect its neighborhood. So some churches are heavy with little kids, others with teenagers, others with young adults, others with, immigration and so on and so forth. We want the church to reflect the neighborhood. That's why everybody will move into the neighborhood and, Lord willing, be from the neighborhood. And that's how we hope and envision it moving from.
So within that network then, because I understand you've had one church planted, you're hoping to do another one relatively soon. If you sort of think in the future, like how much diversity would you allow within that network? Because you're talking about a network, you're not necessarily talking about your own denomination.
Right.
I understand. Yeah. So what happens if you've got sort of an evangelical gospel preaching Presbyterian church that says, hey, we're interested in joining this effort. We want to be part of your network. We want to, work in there. Does that work for you guys? Does that, does that fit into the vision?
Absolutely. In fact, we've been pretty broad in the sense of we have a kind of a doctrinal statement, which quite frankly, Winston, is very similar to that of the TGC Canada doctrinal statement. And so basically they have to sign off on it. But at the end of the day, when they get there and they have a particular bend or leaning, especially as they try to exegete the neighborhood they're going to be moving into and how that's all going to unfold, there's a lot of liberty in regards to a particular maybe denominational flag that they want to fly there on their flagpole. So we're trying to be a bit more diverse with that. I would be quite open. There is an evangelical Anglican church in this city that we have a wonderful relationship with. And although they're not officially part of the network, we will definitely work every way we can with them to come alongside them. And if God ever opened doors for partnerships, I'd be all over that. So I guess, again, it's not that I've created something new. I took what I felt was even some of the best strengths of TGC, the idea of being gospel-centered and not so much boundary-bound, but center-bound, and trying to do that. And again, one of the nice things about being here on an island is I am isolated, so I don't have some of the tensions that you guys would face kind of like in the epicenter of our country in the GTA area. The other thing is because the need is so great, there's not a lot of options to just argue. And, there's people here that need to hear about Jesus. And there's not a lot of tribalism to be able to be clung to because there's nothing here. And so that's been one of the other probably unique things about our model is it's allowed me, especially in Canada, to not always just go after one group and say, you kind of love us. Because one, I don't think Canadians, we don't have that luxury. We don't have the luxury of being so narrow-minded and blinded to our own little universe. We're a very big country with a very minimalist population and a smaller church. And unless we come together, the other thing that I've been taught in this, and this is unique to me, I guess, often missions and church planting is, I've often said missions so much in my world anyway, it's been like you're the mob. Until you're dead or I'm dead, we're stuck together. So I've tried to sell it more about the idea of partnerships and coalescing. So when we go to people, and the other thing is many churches in Canada, they're not large. So when they hear stuff like this and it's going to take millions of dollars to plant these churches and pay this and recruit this, they're like, guys, we're a church of 50 or 100. What are we going to do? It feels like you're spitting at a comet. So what we've done is we've targeted, in an ideal world, if I could get 100 to 200 churches in all of Canada that could afford to do $200 a month, but do that with us for 5, 7, or 10 years, we can actually bankroll half of the church plants we want to do. And, most Canadian churches, when they hear that, they're like, what? Because that's much more doable than if I said, I need to raise $70,000 a year to pay somebody and run a ministry. Most churches would hear that and say, well, listen, boy, that'd be great if we could pay our pastor that, that type of thing. But when you break it down into bite sizes and you realize that we can do that together, and then my goal is that, there's a saying here that when God saves a Newfoundlander, they get all the way saved, including their pocketbook. We are a very generous culture. And so here, 50, 60 people actually would give and be a self-sustaining church and be able to then contribute to mission. And so our goal is that by 2030, if God gives us this, that we now have some, not just living, breathing entities and expressions of the bride of Christ here in St. John's, but ones that can now give to the rest of Canada for something that we can see the next region, done. And I think that if we took more of that kind of a posture, quite frankly, even in Canada, and stop trying to be so attractional and stuff like that, and stop looking for the big mega church and the big celebrity pastor. In fact, I would throw this out, guys. If you actually do the math on what it costs to staff and run and all the things, a church that can hold 1,000 people, you'd be shocked that you could run probably 5, 6, or 7 smaller churches for the same amount of money, and I think have a much bigger impact on a particular region. Plus, if you have moral failure, if you've got a church of 1,000 people and the head elder falls into sin, you're likely losing half that church. But if you've got a smaller church and you've got 6 or 7 other churches that can do emergency medicine and love on and come alongside, I think you've got a much better opportunity to salvage the collateral damage than when you've got these big, giant mega machines. And if I'm going to be opinionated about anything, I think that the mega church's days are numbered, if not already past. Especially,
I think you're right, Stephen. And just thinking in terms of COVID, this is a reason to have smaller churches going forward, I think. And I see Canada as a largely post-Christian country, and I just don't see much of a future for mega churches, especially north of the 49th parallel. I'm kind of curious about people on the ground in Newfoundland. You said that, a lot of people were affiliated, at least with the United Church, the Anglican Church, the Catholic Church. Are these individuals who were baptized as babies? Mm-hmm. And then do they see themselves as Christians, or do they resent Christianity? Is it the case that they think they understand Christianity, but really don't? Or are they just completely ignorant of the gospel completely? Who are you encountering on the streets in St. John's?
So I would say we're probably, if you look at Quebec today, if you've done any study with the province of Quebec today, I'd say that's where Newfoundland, especially St. John's, will be in probably another 5 to 10 years. So that deep entrenched cultural Catholicism, Anglicanism, but even, so I'm 49, but even the people down to as low as 29, in the city of St. John's, if you said, are you religious? Most people will say yes. They'll say, so, what are you? And they'll say, I'm Catholic, I'm Anglican, I'm United. Now, that's only because they're keeping our affections for our grandparents here, we call them Nan and Pop. They're keeping Nan and Pop happy. They were christened. They might have been, the odd one will have been confirmed. They might go at Easter, they might go at Christmas, but basically they've got a label, but they effectively live. So we are culturally religious and practically pagan. Okay, so there's a lot of spirituality. What's happening in St. John's, though, is the rise of our university. So Memorial University has almost 20,000 live students. And between Memorial University and our community college called CONA, the College of the North Atlantic, there's about 30,000 students. So think about that. That's about 11% of the population of the city. And a large portion of that is from other countries, China, India, the Middle East. So this is starting to bring some diversity with the rise of secularism. And so there is this resentment. So I think we'll be where Quebec is. A church will be a nicety. It'll almost be a tourist attraction. It'll be something we go, you remember those days, but now everybody's moved on. So that's another deception and hard thing for church people coming to Newfoundland. I can have religious conversations here all day long. I can go to any coffee shop, any religion or restaurant. But the moment I tell a Newfoundlander, your church doesn't save you, Christ does, Now we're in for a fight. How dare you say that to me? So that's the religious argument. And then there would be the ones that now have moved on secularly. I don't care. I'm going to live the way I want to live. So there's a rise. I would say there's another rise here, which I think is similar to Canada, of spiritualism. So I think a lot of Newfoundlanders are swapping out their religious heritage because they see all the inconsistencies, the hypocrisies, and they're just adopting a form of spirituality. So there's a lot of that. So, that's the biggest thing. But to be honest, the entrenched cultural thing of I'm Catholic, I'm Anglican. I mean, my father, when he got saved, my grandfather didn't care. He didn't know what saved, converted, born again. These were weird things that he heard in the hushed tones over in the Salvation Army or the Pentecostal world. But when my father got baptized and actually left his Anglican church and joined this Baptist church that my grandfather never heard of, he buried my father's birth certificate in his backyard and had a funeral for my dad. Never spoke to my dad for 3.5 years. And I've got to give you stories and stories and stories of grandparents and parents telling their children, you'll be out of the will. You're shaming our family. So I get a lot of people that are interested in our church, interested in our model, and will even come, but they're not going to leave. My grandmother got saved at a Salvation Army kind of evangelistic meeting, never left her United Church. And when she died, had the funerals at the United Church. She's buried in a United Church cemetery. But I do think, I always tell people, when you fly over Quebec and over New Brunswick and you enter into here, you've come back in time about a decade. So I would say we're about a decade behind where the rest of it, the Maritimes are into Quebec, and then maybe even 15 years behind where Montreal and Toronto are. You guys are on the cutting edge. The wave of everything new kind of crashes up on you first and then slowly makes it down. Now, the danger is anything that crosses the St. Lawrence and gets itself here, a weird hybrid perversion of it tends to crop up, and it's really hard to deal with. So I think you guys have the struggle that you're dealing with new stuff all the time. I don't deal with that, but whatever does get here takes hold.
Yeah, I've got in front of me the Ode to Newfoundland, which has got these lyrics: "As loved our fathers, so we love. Where once they stood, we stand. Their prayer we raise to heaven above. God guard thee, Newfoundland." It's an interesting, it invokes God there and the idea of prayer, but it's very closely linked to, our fathers, our ancestors. We stand where they stand. We love what they love. Yeah. Am I reading that right? That's linked to what you're saying here in terms of, hey, we don't turn our back on the religion of our ancestors.
No, and because we're an island and everybody knows we're the butt end of every joke, so everybody's got their favorite Newfie joke and all these things. We're typically these types of things. So when you're here, there's a deep sense of loyalty of we look into the wind and we shout at it, we fish, we do things difficult. It's hard here, but we've survived and we've cut out a little bit of paradise. It's very nice here. The water is clean and crisp. The air is beautiful. If you're here, there's an expression, you can take the boy out of Newfoundland, but you can't take Newfoundland out of the boy. And so those types of things. And so there's those, but yet the coat of arms for Newfoundland and Labrador has Matthew 6:33. That's right on the bottom of our coat of arms. In fact, only in the last year was there some talk of, should we remove that? But now the other thing about Newfoundland is a lot of this kind of stuff that you get, Newfoundlanders are very in favor of the underdog. So when things happen here, if you do something and you step out of the cultural norms, whether it's sexual ethics or these types of things, you'll get a big kind of brouhaha. But after you've taken your pound of flesh from somebody, after about 2 weeks, if you still keep beating up on that person, then the culture says enough. Like, all right, you don't like them, you beat them up for a while, knock it off, move on. And so we don't get kind of that settled hatred that I think sometimes evangelical Christianity can face in the mainland. Ours is more flash in the pan. We're very emotional people here in Newfoundland. So we're caught up in the moment, but then we move on.
So, Stephen, I was thinking about what you said about the coat of arms, at McMaster University in Hamilton, in different parts of the campus on different buildings, you'll have in Greek what Paul says in Colossians 1 about all things cohering in Christ. And I think the only reason why it's permitted to be up there still, it's because it's in Greek and most people don't know what it says. But I think what you're saying is that it's so important for the church in Newfoundland to have, as you mentioned before, indigenous church planters and indigenous pastors. And it seems that attempts at church planting in previous decades have failed in part because, those who came just really didn't understand the culture. How are you going to keep those that you're bringing to Christ, that you're nurturing in those churches in Newfoundland? And what happens in a lot of cases is guys go off to seminary and then end up who knows where. Do you have a plan or some idea for retaining those that show aspirations and ability and a call to gospel ministry? Do you have a way to keep them in Newfoundland?
Bill, that is the $64 million question that could be a whole other podcast for us, that could get a little bit political. It is my one burden for this country. It is the way we do secondary education, theological training. So far, we are working with a school across the pond again, Union School of Theology. Michael Reeves oversees that because I am desperate to get a Canadian institution to work with us. I am fighting everything in me to not send young men and women to Toronto or to, the prairies or to Vancouver to train, not because I'm anti that, it's because they're not going to come back. And it's an exorbitantly expensive proposition. So I'm pleading with the Canadian church and some of our Canadian theological institutions that we need to find a way to work together to a couple things: make it more affordable, make it much more grassroots on the ground. I want to raise them up. So we have been blessed. Almost everybody I have right now are native indigenous Newfoundlanders. But the biggest struggle I have with some 23-year-olds is educating them theologically. And that is something I really wish we could pray for in our country, that, the idea of letters after the name and ATS approval and some of these things and the costs, I just think sometimes we got to look in the mirror in the West and go, have we made Christianity too much of a business and not a much of a calling?
Steve, there's two things that pop to mind as you're speaking, two themes that are running through everything you've been telling us. One of them is, it's obvious that you've done your cultural exegesis.
Right.
You've obviously spent a lot of time thinking about what kind of culture you live in and what are its peculiarities and what are its unique nature, and then how do we reach that particular culture for the gospel? And then, let's start with that one. Can you say a little bit more about the importance of that? I'm thinking about our listeners, wherever they might be. It's obvious that this is something that's real for you. Speak to us a little bit the importance of knowing your culture in terms of wanting to do mission at it.
Yeah, and this has been a help from 20 schemes. I'd encourage people to go to their website, check it out. But I'll bring this right to the Bible. I mean, where this really hit me was the Jerusalem church down to the church at Antioch. And just that little interplay with Barnabas being sent down and Barnabas taking note of that the work of the Holy Spirit was there. And yet, no doubt, if you study it, how the church in Antioch expressed itself, did things, its makeup was vastly different from Jerusalem. Even the tensions through the epistles and even Paul's life and how he acted when he's in Asia, how he acts when he goes back to Jerusalem. And so this is the thing. So I spent and I'm from Newfoundland, but I hadn't lived here in a decade and a half. So I spent almost 18 months just living here and trying to re-understand the people I was going to live amongst, studying the city. How had the city changed since I lived here last? Where were the subdivisions? What was gentrification? What was now the trouble spots? I knew them from the 1990s. I didn't know them from 2015. So I really had to learn that. Where was the university having an influence? Where was it predominantly still just typical Newfoundlanders, but where was there a lot more immigration? Where had the new churches popped up since I had moved away and come back? The Jewish synagogue had gone through changes. There was a mosque built. There was a second mosque being built. What was in those vicinities? Why? How was these things happening? What was going on with government? What was happening? I met with police officials. I met with social services people. I met with paramedics, fire departments, all of these things, politicians. I took a tour of our government, met with all the leaders that would meet with me and just asked, what's happening? What are you happy with? What are you not happy with? What's going right? What's going wrong? Called as many churches as I could, asked if I could talk. That's how I asked them, what's your membership? What's your average attendance? How long have you been here? What's going right for you? What are you excited about? What are you discouraged about? and just kept copious notes, did this, had a couple of other people then start coming on with me, and we studied and studied. And then we started to figure out neighborhoods. So the first place where church planting is Kilbride. It's a place of 8,000 to 12,000 people. There hasn't been a church there in 138 years. And last week we had our first convert, someone who just came to Christ. As far as we know, maybe the first one in that neighborhood, and just how God is working. And so this is how we're targeting our neighborhood. So I would say that can be done in the GTA, that can be done in Manitoba, that can be done in Vancouver, that can be done in, Trois-Rivières, that can be done anywhere. And I also think it provides for people like us and what we're doing for your listening audience. I think this is a model that could bring us a lot more together than apart, and stop having us fight over crumbs, but actually working together.
Well, that leads into the second thing that I've been noticing in what you've been telling us, is that your whole model, you could have said, hey, there's all these needs. Let's build up this, a big church with lots of programs that meets everybody's needs. But your approach, the word that comes to mind is humble. It's not seeking attention or growth for yourself as such, but it's really saying, look, there's people that need to know of Jesus. There's people that need to know, the good news of the cross of Christ. And so let's make that our goal. And then let's just organize everything else accordingly. Let's organize everything else to reach that goal, and spend a whole lot of less time thinking about, or I should say, that the controlling thought there is not, how do I make sure I maintain my own boundaries and my own tribe? But the controlling thought is there's people who don't know the name of Christ and who need to have the good news that Christ has got his people in this city, and they need to be called through gospel proclamation in order to come to Christ. Yeah, I really appreciate that. Am I explaining that, in a way that makes you nod your head and say, yeah, that's what I'm trying to do?
So I guess here's the thing. I love guys like RC Sproul, John Piper, these guys. I love these guys, and then the Puritans and all these things. But there's a handful of names that you and I can name that we read and we follow. But there are tens of thousands of unknown names behind all of those who have faithfully served the Lord. When I grew up, one of the big factors that changed my heart was David's mighty men, that are largely faceless, nameless guys. But they did amazing things for Christ. And so I guess that partly drives me. And I'm a creature. I grew up in this young, restless reform world, but now I'm old enough to see the crashing and the burning of too many celebrity pastors who have sinned out, flamed out, burned out, embarrassed, stalled things. And so I just don't think that's the way Christ wants his church to be. And so I would call us all, when we are hoping to one day build a church building for Calvary, but we were very deliberate. The sanctuary will hold 250 people total. That's it. Because if we fill that, then it's time to spread out. And I'm not interested in building a kingdom and people being like, look what Steve did. I want people to look at St. John's and go, look what God did. And, at this point, I guess my biggest thing has been, Lord, am I playing the role of David or Solomon, in the sense of where the Lord says, Stephen, it's a great plan. You're going to do a lot of work. Not much is going to happen, but you'll lay the groundwork for someone to follow, and they're going to just see wonderful things. Or is God going to allow us to see some incredible things while I live? I'm almost 50. I figure I've got a few years left. I want to try and use those well. I want to finish well. And my only desire is just to give God glory. And as God chooses to save, then he gets all the credit.
Yeah. Amen to that.
Yeah, it's so interesting you say that, Stephen. You and I are about the same age. I turned 50 in December. And when I entered ministry, I was ordained at the age of 25. I had these big ambitions. And now my ambitions are far more modest. I want to stand firm to the end, in part because of all these celebrity pastor casualties that you've mentioned. And I think there's a lot of logic to setting these modest goals for churches to, once you reach 200 max, maybe you launch another church. I see so much wisdom in there from so many different angles that I really think that the approach that you're proposing for St. John could probably be implemented in a lot of big urban cities throughout the country as well. But, our time has gone. And so I wonder if I could conclude with this question. Is there one thing in particular that you would want us and our listeners to pray for as you continue your work there?
Well, I mean, obvious, and again, this is not at all to be trite, but that God would sovereignly be pleased to save men and women in our city, in St. John's, that he would do that. And then I guess as a part of the bigger church, as I think about your denomination and fellowship of churches, as I think of our country, that this is not the time for us to be fighting over politics and all of these things, but actually organizing and being humbled enough to say, okay, Lord, how do we make ourselves networked and nimble in the face of a pressing against culture, where we can actually make a difference in neighborhoods? Because I actually think that will slow down the deceit of Satan and the destruction of this culture, which is self-destructing all around us. And if you go back to the first century, I believe that's what happened. Neighborhoods, families, households were getting transformed by the gospel. And it's a lot harder when you want the big effigy buildings and you want, your name up and you want to be the newscaster or the guy that gets on the news. I just think that puts you in harm's way, both coming and going, that we don't want to be as Christians. And so, if anything, if this could be a something that catches fire amongst our Canadian church, then I think that if the Lord allows that, that would be amazing for me.
Steve, you've given us lots of food for thought, and I hope that our listeners will also take time to pray for you. Thanks so much for being on the podcast. And to quote the ode to Newfoundland, God guard you, Steve Bray, and God guard Newfoundland.
Amen. Thank you so much, everybody.
Bill, a little while ago, someone told me this neat analogy about evangelism or about church planting. And it just uses the image of a dandelion, of which, dandelions are covering my front lawn at the moment. But a dandelion, when it turns all white, basically it's all little seeds on parachutes. And then the wind blows those little parachutes and they blow away, and the seed, hopefully plants down and plants another dandelion. I think one dandelion, on average reproduces itself with about 10 other dandelions. So it's kind of a neat image for evangelism or of church planting. And Steve's whole idea here is saying, let's, rather than grow big, let's try to start a bunch of 10 little churches in various neighborhoods. And then as those grow bigger, that they reach a certain size where they go off and do the same thing. So it's a little bit of like a dandelion model to church planting. I know that you mentioned in the interview that you thought that was a great idea. Yeah, I would agree with that. Tell us more about what you think.
Well, I think for one, commuter churches generally have a very difficult time being missional. And I say that as the pastor of a church that's largely a commuter church. What happens in a commuter church is that you don't have members invested in any particular neighborhood. Now, we've tried at Blessings to invest in the neighborhood of the church building where very few of our members actually live. And so that's very, very challenging. I think you can discern far better if you have neighborhood churches, the impact of the gospel. And when I say discern, I'm talking about unchurched people seeing how the gospel reshapes us. I think that's much more readily accessible and perceivable if you have neighborhood churches. Secondly, Tim Keller often points out that once a church exceeds 200, it begins to lose some of its missional impetus, and resources begin to turn inward rather than outward. I appreciate, thirdly, Steve's warnings about celebrity pastors. And, if you keep churches small, the likelihood of celebrity evolving in churches is quite small, because often in North America, and especially in America, it's the pastor of the large church that is typically celebrated. So we can probably do a lot better just to preserve the moral integrity of pastors by keeping churches small. So I think for any one of these reasons, it's an approach that has a lot to commend for it.
Yeah, interestingly, in our own church history, if you go back into the Netherlands, before the liberation, there were very large churches in cities that had, a very big congregation. We would feel uncomfortable. I think if there was a Canadian Reformed church that had 2,000 members, we would be like, that's way too big. That's crazy. Some people are more comfortable with a church with 600 or 700 members, and others say, no, we prefer something small. you can have a discussion about that. But what I really appreciated about his idea was saying, hey, even if we build a building, we're just going to build a building that can fit 200, 250, because the mission of this church is to expand into other neighborhoods to draw other people to Christ through gospel preaching. So irrespective of whether or not a bigger church can serve other needs or do good things, his vision is to say, well, we're just going to keep it small for the sake of missionary expansion. And I think that that has a lot to commend to it. If your church is so dedicated to missionary expansion that it on purpose builds a smaller building, that speaks to a central goal and mission of the church. I think that's beautiful.
Yeah. And just don't you think it would be amazing? I mean, you're in Ottawa, but if you think of a strong gospel presence in every neighborhood, wouldn't that just be an amazing thing to look at a map of the city and see in every neighborhood a strong gospel church? I just think that would be an answer to prayer, which makes me want to ask you, Winston, what you think about establishing a network of this sort that includes churches from different theological traditions. Is that something that's realistic to do? Is that something that is itself commendable? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I guess on a more national level, I'm part of the Gospel Coalition, which operates along those lines, saying, hey, we've got differences, strongly held differences, where we're not just shrugging our shoulders at things like baptism. We're saying, no, one of us is right and one of us is, but we're still willing to work together in these areas to see Christ proclaimed. I think about the fact that there's also been, in Canadian Reformed churches, out in Manitoba, they want to plant a church in Niverville. They don't plant it in another place because there's a Reformed Baptist church there. And so instead of planting it right next door to Reformed Baptist church, they go to a different area because they trust, although they have differences with them, they understand that the gospel of Jesus Christ is being preached in that location. And so, they decide to go elsewhere. So I think we already see that. And I think, a lot of people would already think along those lines. And I know, you're involved in various networks in the city of Hamilton. I'm involved and know lots of different pastors and churches here in Ottawa, working in it as a network to say, well, let's try to have people who are giving people the opportunity to hear the gospel of Jesus Christ preached in their neighborhood from various kinds of churches is a good and a beautiful thing. And that to say that, and yet in the same breath say, and yet I cherish like anything my view of the covenant and my understanding of the church and the role of children in God's covenant, and all those things. I'm not downplaying that whatsoever. And yet when it comes to mission work in this very large country of ours, and this very large world of ours, where there's just millions and millions of people that are going out, are living their life with never hearing the name of Jesus, that it seems to me that we ought to be compelled to work in networks or work with other believers in order to have Christ proclaimed.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think it's partly just the state of our country that some of these theological differences and debating over them is a luxury we can't afford, given the high percentages of the unchurched population in Canada. So I think we want to identify those core doctrines and collaborate with churches that share them. And it doesn't mean, as you said, doesn't mean at all that we're embarrassed about being reformed or that we're willing to compromise some of our cherished reform views either.
Yeah, and keep and understanding and having your eyes wide open to the difficulties that might include in a practical level. So, if you can go collaborate in some project with the local Salvation Army, but they don't have sacraments. Your collaboration, obviously your closest collaboration is your own federation. You're federated with them. And then you've got sister churches and you've got NAPARC churches, and then you've got other gospel preaching churches, and your level of, or your ability to collaborate and cooperate with them on different levels will be different for each one of those. But that doesn't mean that we can just write off or neglect, other churches that are faithfully preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ. Why don't we leave it at there, Bill? Thanks so much for doing another episode. I really do hope that our listeners will benefit from this, and that we can keep on speaking in grace-filled ways about the missional mandate of the Canadian Reformed Churches.